And the methods behind that, and the ethics behind the methods, and the politics behind the data that are involved in all those processes between the production of data right through to decision making. And in particular, so the issue I'm particularly interested in is time and space and the ways in which we measure those things as a place. So category making, so we can think of cities, towns, how are these things bounded, and how do we measure them over time? Because of course they grow, and then so you might want to say York is that boundary at that point in time, but then it grows. So how do we then measure York? What is York? How's that space different? And how do we measure those changes? So the challenge I'm interested in, how do we do measurement over time in an ethical way, in a way that also allows policymakers or decision makers to make decisions that are actually useful and meaningful to them. And the kind of onus here is on categories, because we live by categories, is what I'm trying to kind of get at here. And politics of category making around data-driven processes are crucial to how we think about ethics and non-ethics. We can think of ethics and non-ethics as a categorical making process, and the data-making processes of them. So I hope it'll become a bit clear, but I really want to give you that introduction because it may seem a little bit out there in terms of the methods that I'm going to be bringing, but I'll try and bring it to life in terms of the built environment. So specifically I'm talking about big data, but that's a very broad term, and the big data that I'm thinking about are, there's all sorts of data in that, but specifically I'm thinking of Experian, who you might know from the credit card company, collects all the global credit card company. If you've ever given even the first part of your postcode, they get it, and they harvest it, and they use Tesco Club Card in the UK, and they also do focus groups and the census as well. So it's an amalgamation of huge data sets. It's a global company, so they actually have data on India, China, Australia, New Zealand, and we've got a version. How many people have heard of Mosaic? Okay, so just by introduction, Mosaic is just one of many data sets. It's the one that we, breweries will buy this data set to decide where to put their new brewery. Has big implications on where people decide to build. And the way this is, it basically uses a credit card company, Tesco, and in different countries. So I think it's Walmart in America. They have different kinds of data sets feeding into this. And they split, they categorize space and individuals in space by doing a series of clustering processes, effectively, different kinds of cluster analysis, that basically categorize the whole region into quite specific units. So in the UK, the postcode is between 10 to 20 households, and that's how low they go. So they've got, Experian is about 65 categories, made up of about, I think, 11 main ones, and the 11 main ones are actually global ones. So they've got super rich right down to quite fine detailed descriptions of who we are, how we live, what newspapers we buy, what food we purchase. And it's this process of category making and ways in which these categories are then sold to companies to decide where to build, which grows to function and so on. So it's thing. And my issue with it, well, I've got a number of issues. But a lot of them, I'm going to limit it to the methodological issues around 5 of these, because it's one thing to kind of go, well, these categories are not very good or bad, but actually, in terms of actually thinking about how the world works, I think there are even bigger problems. And then I've got some conclusions. So very quickly, big data and urban policy assume that the world can be changed. That's what we assume. assume it can be used, and we assume that the policy can be transformative. The linear modelling that goes in, particularly time series, where they measure variables, population change in this way, number of men went down that way. You know, the individual variables that are measured are not necessarily congruent to a world where it's actually the region or the company or the institution or the case that is actually changing. It's not our variables. We're not individually, our variables are part of us for sure, but it's the case that's changing, it's the region that's changing, it's the neighbourhood that's changing. And actually the modelling that goes in between doesn't actually models variables, not cases. And that's problematic to me. If we're going to design policies that can be evaluated, whether that be an ethical procedure that can then go, well, actually somebody's breached the ethics here. One of the things I'm suggesting is that we assume complexity. By this complexity is a big, in fact for me it's very simple. I use Wardrop's term which he talks about patterns of change. And one of the key patterns of change in complex systems is that they're always changing a bit, but they're kind of mostly not changing in a kind of particular tractor space, and then suddenly they'll change. And we don't know when, it's very difficult to predict. The biggest kind of change that we can think of is the industrial to post-industrial shift. We may go through another one in terms of kind of austerity and globalization going all over the place. Very difficult to predict and certainly not bounded in this categorical way. Methodologically, one of the issues around here is that spatial data, when we divide it up like this, ignores people, generally speaking, and meaning-making people we are. If we don't like change, we will resist change, whether it's good or not, whether it's good or bad for us. Our perceptions of change and the meaning of change is really important. And these sorts of big categorizations don't capture that. Often big data and these processes are used as a sort of objective measures. And the causal explanations around these are sort of quite simple. In fact, a lot of the causal modelling around these things will be, typically regression analysis of various kinds, which sort of say, oh, well, what you need to do is have more of this kind of thing in this neighbourhood, and then it will get better. Or what you need to do in this community is have more of this kind of input, and then it will get better. But these causal mechanisms are actually very complex, and they're multiple. They're not singular. And this category making is often assumes a singular kind of causality. The key issue here is that the data, the big spatial data that our urban systems are made of, it's kind of re-put back into the model, and then the model kind of churns back into the system. So ontologically, the big spatial data that are used in these processes are actually part of the urban systems they seek to model. So in order to understand places, we cut it up into sections and regions. But by doing that, the notion that they can be used to know the world objectively is difficult. We're part of the system. We shouldn't be surprised if we use the same variables to understand the world, and the model says, oh, we need to do this with these variables, that when we try and intervene on those variables, we can't. But we've just created a model out of the same stuff that's produced the problem. Temporarily, there's a discrepancy between temporality and policy and that big data. These decision-making processes, this can take, well, it's updated in real time, but we know decision-makers, making a decision on crucially,